Okay. So apologies for the admin issues there, but by way of background, as John mentioned, I'm a consultant at Pollination, which is a specialist climate change and natural capital advisory and investment firm, and we provide services across the private and public sector in Australia and internationally. And I think before I dig into this topic too deeply, it's actually really interesting to make the point that Pollination was established about 2 years ago now. And its initial focus was squarely in the climate space, with a bit of a nod to nature-based solutions in the context of carbon markets. But there's been sort of a natural evolution in the nature of our work over the past 12 months, and we've already started to see a shift in the way that companies are thinking about nature. So they're coming to us to help them understand how nature loss could impact negatively on their businesses, to set targets to manage their own impacts on nature, and to identify new opportunities in this space in terms of things like green finance and product premiums. And to set the scene a little bit, this swing by corporates towards wanting to understand nature loss and the implications for their business has really been spurred on by two factors. The first is that there's now a really substantial body of information to support the fact that nature loss, like climate change, is a systemic financial risk. And the findings of the Disruptor Review into economics and biodiversity in particular has been the catalyst for a really profound shift in thinking across the corporate world, because its main conclusion was that the global economic system is fundamentally dependent on nature, or what we often now refer to as our natural capital. And this issue has also been underscored by the launch of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which has sent a really powerful signal to the private sector that investor expectations that they'll report meaningfully on their impacts and dependencies on nature and biodiversity are rising really swiftly. And secondly, and this is where the Global Biodiversity Framework fits in, there is clearly significant political momentum building for a transition to a nature-positive economy. And the feeling amongst the private sector is that the Global Biodiversity Framework will become the Paris Agreement for nature. And what this means is that corporates will be looking to the Global Biodiversity Framework as their North Star, with an aim of setting nature-related targets for their businesses that align to the overarching goals of the framework. And when all of these factors are taken together, financial institutions and corporates are really starting to see the writing on the wall, that there's an urgent need to transition the economy to address the nature loss crisis alongside the climate crisis. And in this context, the Global Biodiversity Framework is really important because it's likely to play a key part in mainstreaming biodiversity in the private sector in a similar way to the Paris Agreement has done for climate. And I'll get into the detail of some of the specific targets under the framework shortly, but to give you sort of a zoomed out view, some of the key ways the Global Biodiversity Framework seeks to sort of do this is by setting targets that go to issues such as the need for business to measure and understand their impacts and dependencies on nature, value and account for their contributions, for the contributions of nature in their operations, and ultimately to realign financial flows away from activities that are harmful to nature and towards those that are either neutral or positive to nature. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to sort of start by unpacking my thinking on the draft text with some comments about the importance of target setting for corporates and the role that the framework can play in this space, because I think it's actually one of the most powerful signals we've seen from the private sector that they're serious about taking action on climate change. And there's a lot we can learn from the climate change playbook and apply in the context of nature loss. So I've already flagged that what we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years is a growing expectation that corporates will set targets that are aligned to the net zero goal under the Paris Agreement. And there's an opportunity under the Global Biodiversity Framework to create the settings that will enable corporates to set targets that are aligned with a similar goal for nature. And we know that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is championing the idea of a nature positive future by 2030. And that idea has actually already gained a lot of traction with corporates. So many leading multinationals already have started adopting targets for their businesses that use that term. And as we heard yesterday, some more thought definitely needs to go into the trajectory for achieving a nature positive future so that we don't lock in further loss. But I think the point is that it's actually a really powerful idea and one that the private sector is already rallying behind. And one of the things that I think's really stood out to me in the draft text at the moment is that there's no reference to this concept, or sort of in fairness, an equally pithy target for corporates to hang their hats on. And in particular, the 2030 mission at the moment calls for urgent action to put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. And according to the footnote in the draft text, this phrase implies the need for a stabilisation in the rate of biodiversity the rate of loss of biodiversity and enhanced protection and restoration. But I think that this statement leaves quite significant scope for further loss of nature over the coming decade, because it suggests that all that's required is for us to bend the curve at some point, however minimally, before 2030. But I think by contrast, nature positive would at least mean that we need to ensure that nature is not only not any worse off by 2030, but actually that it should be better off than it is today. And the implications for this are really material, and I hope that this point sticks, because I think that addressing this issue is where we'll truthfully probably get the biggest bang for buck in terms of the impacts of mainstreaming biodiversity across the private sector. I think this is a really big ticket item. But to dig into some of the more detailed issues that really do touch on the role that the private sector has to play in making this framework a success, I think Target 14 looks at the need to integrate biodiversity values across all sectors of the economy, ensuring that all activities and financial flows are aligned with biodiversity values. And given the emphasis here on financial flows, I think it's clear that this is a call to action for the private sector. But the ways in which this target calls for the integration of biodiversity values is primarily through government-led processes. So policy, regulation, planning, development processes, national accounts, and assessments of environmental impacts. And for my part, I'd actually really like to see this target updated to more expressly call for the integration of biodiversity values in business decision-making and investment decisions by the financial sector. And that's actually also true for the proposed indicators, which currently don't seem to mention the private sector at all. And related to this point, Target 15, I think, is in quite good shape. It calls for all businesses to assess and report on their dependencies and impacts on biodiversity, progressively reduce their negative impacts and increase their positive impacts on nature, and ultimately reduce biodiversity risks to businesses. And that framing picks up on the emerging principles of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And I think that that process will really help to ensure that this target gets traction. I think something that might help to close the loop here would be an express reference to the TNFD in the text, but that's probably not essential given how much traction the TNFD already has. And I noticed in the proposed indicators document that that's something that might get called out as a sort of sub-element of this target anyway. So then the last target that I wanted to touch on is target 19, because that's where I think the rubber really hits the road for the private sector. Target 19 calls for an increase in financial resources from all sources to at least $200 billion per year by leveraging private finance. And this builds really effectively on Target 15, because we know that as the TNFD is rolled out and the economy begins to transition away from activities that are harmful for nature, that there'll be a swathe of private capital looking for a new home. And this is where we really need to think through what the market signals are for the private sector to help them understand exactly where they should invest that capital. And this is the final point I'd like to make. And again, I'm drawing on lessons learned from the Paris Agreement here, but one of the most powerful market signals in the Paris Agreement was Article 6, which set up the architecture for international carbon markets and has brought on significant private sector investment into activities to reduce and avoid greenhouse gas emissions, including through nature-based solutions, as Mark just mentioned. But by contrast, I think one of the things that's perhaps missing from the global biodiversity framework is a similar market signal for nature. It doesn't articulate what the opportunities this new framework is creating, and it doesn't really say where the private sector should be investing today. And I'm not necessarily advocating for the development of an international biodiversity offset market, in the context of the nature crisis, but I do think we need to be thinking proactively today about how corporates will look to manage their exposure to nature risks and voluntary nature-related targets as nature-related targets become more common in the private sector. And for example, the guidance from the Science-Based Targets Network on setting voluntary nature targets currently allows corporates to undertake or finance measures that have a positive impact on nature to compensate for their negative impacts. And that's how they can achieve nature positive, according to that initial guidance. And in this context, I think that there could be really significant private sector investment over the coming decades into voluntary nature compensation measures, whether that is biodiversity offsets or the creation of new First Nations managed protected areas. And I think that this is something that requires significant thought. And I think that's the point I'd really like to end on. That is that once we have the private sector measuring and valuing nature and reporting on their impacts and dependencies on nature, we need to make sure that there's a clear signal for the market in terms of how and where private sector players should be investing in nature to manage their risks and to take advantage of new opportunities. And I do think that that's something that could be called out more clearly in the draft text and really help to sort of mainstream the use of private capital for positive nature and biodiversity outcomes. And that's it for me.